Yale, Universidade de Chicago, Wharton Business School e Universidade da Califórnia em Los Angeles. Vamos receber diretamente dos Estados Unidos Dr. John Lott Jr. Desejamos a todos um ótimo encontro.
Well, thank you all very much. It's quite an honor to be invited here. I kind of feel more people know me here than in the United States, thanks to Benny, but I'll have to buy him dinner or something one of these days. Anyway, you know, there's a lot of really important issues, kind of life and death issues that are being addressed here. And if I were to just to get anything across, and that is police are extremely important. I think police are the single most important factor for reducing crime. But the police themselves understand that they virtually always arrive on the crime scene after the crime's occurred. And the question is, what should people do when they're having to face a criminal by themselves? And it turns out that by far the safest course of action for people to take is to have a gun. And if my research convinced me of anything, it's the most vulnerable people in our society who benefit the most from having guns for protection. It tends to be people who are relatively weaker physically, women and the elderly, and people who are the most likely victims of crime. And that overwhelmingly tends to be poor people who live in high crime urban areas. It'd be great if the police were there all the time to protect people, but they're not. Now, I'm going to go through a lot of numbers and facts in a few minutes, but before I do, I wanted to show you kind of a short video that kind of gets at why people have the perceptions about guns that they do. Most people have the perceptions about guns from the media, and the thing is, the media is just incredibly biased. So, for example, if you only hear about bad things that happen with guns and don't hear about any of the benefits, it's not too surprising that people are going to be against guns, thinking, I mean, if you only hear about crimes committed with guns and never hear about people using guns to stop crimes from occurring, why not get rid of the guns? Because then you won't have the crimes occurring anymore. What you don't see is the fact that you may have millions of times, for example, in the United States, where we have data where people use guns to stop crime. That people use guns in the United States to stop crime about 5 times more frequently than guns are used in the commission of crime, but relatively few people would have any idea that that's the case. So I want to start off with just a short video here, just kind of the impression that media creates in people's minds about guns.
Hollywood hates guns. Well, they like them in shoot-'em-up movies. But as soon as it comes to a good civilian using a gun for self-defense, Hollywood turns anti-gun.
She shot herself.
Why the gun owner?
Hollywood constantly portrays people who hate guns.
I'm not a huge fan of weapons.
Now do you see why I don't like guns?
You don't like guns either.
I'm not a big fan of guns. I don't like it.
Why'd I leave the FBI? Guns, mainly.
It's almost as if they're trying to condition people to hate guns. In Hollywood, even Navy SEALs warn against owning guns.
I need a gun to protect the kids when you're not around.
You'd be dangerous to yourself and to the kids.
The wise law enforcement experts constantly urge people not to use
But
them.
in my experience, the problem with carrying a gun is that eventually it will go off.
But Hollywood gets this backwards. In real life, police strongly support civilians owning guns and carrying them for self-defense. A recent survey by the National Association of Chiefs of Police polled thousands of sheriffs and chiefs of police. 76% believe that qualified, law-abiding armed citizens help law enforcement reduce violent criminal activity. Detroit's police chief urges people to carry guns.
So good Americans who are responsible with concealed weapons can make a difference.
He became chief and encouraged civilians to carry guns 6 years ago. Detroit's murder rate fell since then.
I'm excited about our trend downward.
Nationwide, rank-and-file cops show even stronger support for private gun ownership than do police chiefs. More than 90% supported civilians carrying guns. No surprise, Hollywood's cops are wrong, and real-life cops are right. Police are informed by what they see on the street every day. They know how important having a gun is to their own safety, and they know that private citizens can help.
We've seen our Good Samaritans. We've seen them go to the aid to others because they were good Americans with concealed weapons permits.
Many Hollywood crime show writers clearly know nothing about guns and crime. The myths they push on people are endless.
What else do we know about these guns?
This is the machine gun that Davis was firing at us, so-called cop killer.
Stop. Since 1934, there are only 2 known uses ever of a machine gun being used in a murder. Yet Hollywood shows criminals using machine guns to outgun cops all the time. Hollywood also finds endless ways to insult civilians who are using guns.
No good's gonna come from you guys running around here with assault rifles. We're prisoners who run the loose. We got a right to protect our neighborhood.
Yeah, that's a job for law enforcement, not a ragtag militia.
Hollywood plays to bigoted stereotypes, depicting gun owners as dumb hicks.
You got one. Got a fugitive. Hey, get off me, man. They do anything. Officers, please. Hey, let him go. That's not who we're looking for. I kept telling him that. You sure? He looks guilty as hell to me. At least check his papers.
Let him go.
In real life, citizen volunteers and neighborhood watch programs save lives. A 2008 U.S. Justice Department analysis found that crime fell 16% in areas that started a neighborhood watch program compared to those that did not. Some of Hollywood's bias is comical. In this show, a woman asks a federal agent if he's worried about not having his gun in a gun-free zone when he's facing professional killers.
You sure about this no guns thing?
Bad guys won't have them either.
Bad guys won't have them either? Seriously? Has a bad guy ever seen a no guns allowed sign and turned around? In the show, the killers obey the signs and leave their guns behind. But in real life, gun-free zones only encourage criminals. They serve as a magnet for criminals. Virtually all the mass public shootings in the United States since 1950 have occurred in places where general citizens are banned from having guns. The Virginia Beach shooting this year was another example of this. A woman who worked at the municipal office building talked with her husband the night before the attack about bringing her permanent concealed handgun to work for self-defense. But she decided not to because of a city rule against carrying guns. She and 11 others were killed the next day by a disgruntled coworker. In another recent case, a doctor carried a gun anyway, despite his hospital's no-gun policy, and he stopped a mass public shooting. As the district attorney put it, if the doctor did not have a firearm, he'd be dead today. And I believe that other people in that facility would also be dead. That real-life situation would make a gripping TV story, but don't expect to see it. Hollywood bias is everywhere, and it endangers lives by misleading people on guns.
Brazil, I think, is playing an important role in the worldwide gun debate, having influence not only here, but in the United States and in Europe. And one of the things I kind of wanted to go through was just what media and academic experts were predicting was going to happen in Brazil after your new president started enacting his different gun control policies. So these quotes are mainly from 2019 and 2020. And, people have explanations as well. Maybe it fell because of policing policy changes in a few states or whatever, and we'll go through that. But the thing is, they were making these predictions at the same time those things were happening. So here's one from the editorial board for Bloomberg News. Here's a simple fact affirmed by worldwide research for Bolsonaro to consider: more guns mean more deaths by guns, whether by homicide, accident, or suicide. A study in Brazil's state of Sao Paulo, for instance, found that a 1% increase in the number of guns in circulation resulted in a 2% increase in the homicide rate. Or this from National Public Radio in the United States: newly elected Brazilian President Bolsonaro is supremely confident he can reduce violent crime. a core pillar of his election campaign. But his proposal to dismantle national gun laws is precisely the wrong way to go about doing this. Or this is from The Economist, kind of a worldwide magazine. That does not mean that gun control laws was pointless. Without it, Brazil's murder rate would have risen much more rapidly than it did, according to a study by the Institute for Applied Economic Research, a government think tank. Or there are more quotes. This is from 2020. Firearms experts from Austria to Brazil have, firearm experts from Austria to Brazil have surged by more than 377% in the first half of this year as gun ownership increased under the South America's country's right-wing president, Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro's highly controversial relaxation of gun laws, a key pledge in his 2018 campaign, is fueling fears among experts and campaigners that such moves will add to already shocking levels of violence. And here's another one from the New York Times. Bolsonaro's promise to ease gun regulation is worrying some experts who argue that more guns will fuel more violence. Or this is from Al Jazeera. But critics of the president's approach have warned that more guns are not the answer to reducing violent crime in a country where a record homicide, 63,880 homicides, took place in 2017, the most recent year for which data is available. I could go on. There's literally dozens of these types of quotes from 2019 and 2020 predicting that loosening up the gun control regulations here in Brazil were going to lead to massive increases in murder and other violent crime. And just to kind of emphasize here, so this one quote I gave you earlier, a study in Brazil's state of Sao Paulo, for instance, found that a 1% increase in the number of guns in circulation resulted in a 2% increase in homicide. Okay, well, how much has gun ownership increased in Brazil? In 2018, there were about 330,000 licensed firearm owners in Brazil. When you go to recently, it's about 1,680,000. So that's a 409% increase, okay? If it's really each 1% increase in the number of guns is going to have a 2% increase in homicides, how much? So that's like 800 and some percent increase these guys were predicting over that period of time. Instead, rather than increasing by 800%, it fell by 34% from 2018 to last year, from 27.8 to 18.5 homicides per 100,000 people. You know, as I mentioned, a few attribute these drops in crimes to other things. But I just want to emphasize one thing. These quotes that I gave you were from mainly 2019 and 2020. If there were other factors that were explaining the drop in crime, surely they saw those, but they were still making their predictions about disaster. And so there's a list of things. Policing reforms in some states, crime mapping, police training, coordination of military and civilian forces. As I say, the problem is for this argument that these detractors saw those changes being made and they still were predicting increases in homicide. Now, what's this notion that some of the Brazilian states have adopted law enforcement reforms? The thing is, if it was just some that were doing that and that was the reason why it fell, you look across, there are 25 states and the capital district, and yet in all but one of them, the homicide rate fell between 2018 and 2019. I don't have complete data for 2020, but it looks like the trend is pretty much all the ones I could find, it was falling for that also. Well, that doesn't really fit the story that they have there. You can see the drop. It fell, obviously, from 2017 to 2018, but it's continued falling very rapidly after that. Now, one thing in the United States is there have been surveys that have been done of police officers. In the video that you saw, you saw some surveys. Police One is the largest organization of police in the United States. It has about 450,000 police officers or members. Just so you have an idea, there are about 600,000 police. So this is the vast majority of police in the United States belong to this organization. And one of the questions here is, on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being low, 5 being high, how important do you think legally armed citizens are to reducing crime rates overall? So these are the police officers. These are the people who are on the street, who actually have real-world experience about crime and how to stop it. So what you find is that about 76% of police either believe it's either extremely important or very important in terms of reducing crime to have civilians own guns. Because the police realize that they virtually always arrive on the crime scene after the crime's occurred. Whoops. Okay. Now, here's another question from that same survey. This was done a few years ago, but considering mass public shootings such as the recent tragedies in Newtown and Aurora, what level of impact do you think a legally armed citizen could have made? Choose the statement that you think is most accurate. So essentially, one thing that was mentioned in the video is that about 94% of all the mass public shootings in the United States take place where guns are banned. These murderers may be crazy in some sense, but they're not stupid. Their goal is to get media coverage. And they know if they go to a place where victims aren't able to defend themselves, they're going to kill more people and get more media coverage. They know the more they kill, the more media coverage they can get, and their goal is to get media coverage. I'll give you one example of the media coverage. You probably remember the Sandy Hook killer. He wrote what police described as a doctoral dissertation. He had studied mass public shootings over a period of 40 years, and he had collected data on all these mass public shootings, and he graphed out the relationship between the number of people killed and the amount of media coverage, finding to himself that the more that were killed, the more media coverage he would get. And his goal was to go and kill more people than the Norway killer, who at the time had killed by far the most in a mass public shooting. This was before the France 2015 mass public shooting where 160 people were killed. He killed 67 people, and he wanted to go and kill more people than the Norway killer because he wanted to get even more worldwide news coverage. So you can see here, you're asking police, how do you stop these mass public shootings? And what about getting rid of these gun-free zones? 80% of police officers think that you would have reduced the casualties if you'd gotten rid of the gun-free zones. Another 6% that you could have avoided casualties altogether. So 86% of the police in the United States believe that getting rid of gun-free zones would make people safer. Okay, I want to have another video here since I'm mentioning mass public shootings. One of the most pernicious claims out there is the claim that the United States is somehow unique in terms of mass public shootings. And that's simply false. It's just a lot of the shootings in the rest of the world simply don't get the worldwide or national news coverage in the United States that mass public shootings in the United States get. So here's another short video.
You've probably heard that America has the most mass shootings in the world. That's often given as a reason for more gun control. But economist John Lott looked into that claim, and he says it's a myth based on one bogus study.
The United States has the most mass shootings.
By far, the most public mass shootings.
You don't see murder on this kind of scale with this kind of frequency in any other advanced nation on earth.
Where'd that claim come from? Obama and everyone else base it on.
A study done by University of Alabama professor Adam Lankford.
University of Alabama professor Adam Lankford.
This is Adam Lankford.
I studied 171 countries for more than 40 years, 1966 to 2012. And essentially the answer was, not surprisingly, the United States has by far the most public mass shooters.
His claim received coverage in hundreds of news stories, but all these people were misled by Langford. Langford's study claimed that since 1966, there were 90 mass public shooters in the United States, more than any other country. Langford counted 202 shooters in the rest of the world. Langford claimed complete data were available for 171 countries. But how did Langford find every shooting in all these countries, most of which don't speak English? And how did he find all the cases in the years before the internet? Few governments collect this data. Finding complete data for mass public shootings in just one developing country, say India in the 1970s, would be an incredible feat. Many of these shootings would have been reported only in local outlets, in the local language.
That shooting at the Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown, Connecticut.
On the other hand, United States mass public shootings are well documented and hard to miss. If Langford undercounted foreign cases because he missed finding old newspapers or had trouble with language barriers, his paper's entire conclusion that the United States had the most mass public shootings would fall apart. Many journalists and researchers asked Langford for his data. Not only did he refuse to share a list of his cases, or even the number of shootings he found in each country, which are nowhere in his paper, he even refused to share an explanation for how he found those cases. That's academic malpractice. Asked if he used foreign languages to search for these shootings, Langford stated, "My data were not limited to English language searches." Asked what languages he used, Langford refused to provide that information. "This is all the assistance I can provide at this time," Langford said. Look, I've researched crime for decades, and I've published dozens of peer-reviewed academic articles on the subject. Langford won't even respond to my emails with simple questions. Now, maybe he doesn't want to talk to me because I'm well known for my research, More Guns, Less Crime. But Langford has refused to share his list of shooters and methods, even with strong gun control advocates. This all seemed very suspicious to me. So the think tank that I run, the Crime Prevention Research Center, researched it. Unlike Langford, we took a lot of time to find all the foreign cases we could. We even got translators to identify cases. Using the same definition of mass public shooters Langford used, 4 more people killed in a public place, not part of some other type of crime, we found that he grossly undercounted foreign attacks. We counted well over 3,000 shooters, at least 15 times more shooters as Langford claimed.
31% of total shooters, despite the fact that we only have 5% of the world's population.
Of the 86 countries where we have identified any mass public shootings occurring, the United States ranks 62nd. Norway, Finland, Switzerland, and Russia are European countries with significantly higher rates of murders from mass public shootings.
The explanation is firearm ownership rate.
When Langford's data are fixed, there is no relationship between gun ownership rates and mass public shooters. There's a lesson here. Langford's critical but simple error could have been picked up if journalists had only demanded his data and methods before publicizing his study. Journalists should learn to be skeptical. In the meantime, we should all be skeptical of news coverage of studies like this that simply confirm what journalists and people want to hear.
Before releasing this video, I also asked Langford for his data and methods for finding shootings in foreign language media. Langford would not provide the information.
Okay. Let me ask you guys a question. I think this is a useful question to consider asking people when you debate the issue of guns. And that is, can you name me one place, any place in the world, where guns have been banned, either all guns or all handguns, that has seen its murder rate fall? Because I can't find such a place. You know, United States, we've tried this a couple times. Washington, D.C. Here's a graph that shows Washington, D.C.'s murder rate relative to the other cities in the top 50. It was falling prior to February 1977 when Chicago's handgun ban went into effect. And then it went back up afterwards, about 40 to 60% higher, 80% at the end. Here's Chicago. Here's Chicago's murder rate relative to the murder rate in the 9 other largest cities. It was falling up until October 1982 when Chicago's ban went into effect, and then it started rising again over time. It was falling before, and then right after the handgun ban went into effect, it went up. Now, in the United States, a lot of gun control advocates will say, well, you know, this wasn't really fair. And the reason why they say it wasn't fair is because they say unless you can ban guns every place in a country, gun bans won't work because people could go and get the guns from the rest of Illinois or from Indiana or from Maryland or Virginia. There's a problem with that. One is, it would have been nice if they had told us before the ban that they didn't think it was going to work. But beyond that, criminals could have gotten guns from those other places to begin with. It's not obvious why that explains an increase. It may explain why murder rates didn't fall as much as gun control advocates were claiming it would, but it doesn't explain the big increases that we saw. But there's another bigger problem, and that is there are countries around the world that have banned guns, okay? Either all guns or all handguns. And yet you see increases every single time. There's not one time. So if you think guns on net are bad, then surely getting rid of the guns or banning them would lower murder rates and other things. But yet you never see that. Out of randomness, you think once or twice you would see a ban associated with a drop in murder rate, even if it had nothing to do with it. But you don't see that. Every single time. So one thing I'll show you is some graphs for some island nations, because this should be the perfect experiment. You have no neighbor to go and blame for the guns that are there. So here's Ireland. Ireland's gun ban went into effect in 1972. Prior to 1972, you can see the murder rate was bouncing up and down, was fairly low. And then as soon as the ban went into effect, the murder rate soared. Now, some people would go and point out that you have a lot of drug gang crime in a couple of these places here. But even if you take those out, it's still going to be much higher. And the thing is, the drug gang criminals were still able to go and get the guns. Here's Jamaica. Jamaica's murder rate prior to 1975 was very similar to the murder rate in the United States. But as soon as their ban went into effect in 1975, you can see what happened to their murder rate. Now, again, people would go and say there, at this one point here, there was drug gang violence, and over here, there was more drug gang violence here at the end. But even if you take out those, it was still much higher afterwards. And the thing is, one of the problems that you have with criminals getting guns in the United States and in some of these other countries, where do you think the main source of illegal guns come from? They come from drug gangs. It's not like a drug gang can go to the police and say, this other gang stole our drugs. Can you help us get them back? All right? The drug gangs have to set up their own little militaries in order to protect that extremely valuable property that they have. And here's another one. This is the UK. I was debating with a journalist earlier today about this. But the UK's handgun ban went into effect in January 1997. And you can see in the next 8 years, there was about a 50% increase in the homicide rate in the UK. And then it started to come back down after that. After about 16 years, it was about as low as it was prior to the gun ban. Why did it peak and why did it come back down? Well, people got really upset about the amount of gun crime that was occurring and with about a number of homicides. So within about just a couple year period here, you had a 14% increase in the number of police. In about a 3-year period, you had about an 18%. And that peak is exactly when this peaked here and began to come down. It was only after you had this huge increase in the number of police that it stopped going up and started to come back down. But yet, even with that big increase in police, that just brought it back down to where it was beforehand. Okay, so I just, well, okay. Now, often in discussions that people have about guns and crime, they make comparisons across countries. And they'll say, look, the United Kingdom has a lower murder rate than the United States has, and they have very strict gun control laws. Almost nobody's allowed to go and own a gun in the United Kingdom. And so it must be the strict gun control laws that cause the low homicide rates that they have in the UK, or murder rates. Here's the problem. They had even lower murder rates and homicide rates before they had the gun ban, as I just gave you an example. After they had the ban, the murder rates went up. They went up relative to what it was in the United States. But there are very few academics that make purely cross-sectional comparisons. I'm going to show you some data looking at cross-sectional, but I just want to warn you to begin with that most don't do it. Most academics look at places over time to see how a murder rate changes before and after a ban, kind of like the graphs I was showing, and do it over many places. So, and the reason why they do that is because there's so many things that can vary across places. You know, you take the UK, for example. It's almost mind-boggling to me, but you go back to 1900, you have like 2 gun murders in London, a city of 8 million people, guns extremely widely owned, and you have 2 gun murders, or you have 5 armed robberies that occur in the place. There's lots of reasons why you have different crime rates across different places. Okay, I guess I did do gun-free zones. So, you know, one of the things, I'm going to skip this. So there's different types of data. I just want to show you some data on homicide rates across countries. I think for some reason I got the wrong thing here, but I had more recent up-to-date stuff. But this is the homicide rates across all countries. The blue is the average. The green is where Lebanon is the median, and the United States is in red. So if you look across all the countries, you can see where the United States is. We're kind of in the middle in terms of the countries. If you look at firearm homicides, the United States is much higher relative to other countries. You can see the average is the red, the green is the United States, and way down over here is the median. So half are above and half are below. What do you think the difference is between these 2 graphs? Well, one difference you can see is that the words are a little bit bigger on this than they were on the previous one. And the lines are thinner over here. Why is that? Well, it turns out that only about half the countries in the world report firearm homicide data. And which ones do you think don't report firearm homicide data? The ones that tend not to report firearm homicide data are the high homicide countries. Well, let's say the United States have been right in the middle, and the top half of the countries there didn't report firearm homicides. It could make it look like the United States had the top firearm homicide rate. But it was simply an artifact of what countries do, report the data. Here's for developed countries in the world. You can see Brazil was pretty high. This is a few years ago. Mexico, Russia, Chile, slightly higher than the United States, other countries that are here. The interesting thing is, usually when most people in the rest of the world make comparisons, they just are very selective. They'll pick like 10 developed countries rather than reporting all the developed countries. And this is the type of graph you frequently will see. You'll see guns per 100 people and gun-related deaths per 100,000 people. In the you'll see a positive line here saying more guns mean more deaths. Well, there are lots of problems with this graph. I'm just going to show you some other graphs in a minute. But one of the central problems here is guns per 100 people. You could have 100 guns per 100 people, and you could have either one gun for each person, or you could have 100 guns owned by one person, all right? Both of them will get you 100 guns per 100 people, but it seems to me those are two very different things in terms of whether or not people can use guns defensively. If that one person has 100 guns, probably once he gets past about the 16th gun, it's probably not going to make a big difference in terms of his ability to use a gun defensively. But if I have all 100 people have one gun each, you're going to have a lot more defensive gun uses that are going to be occurring in terms of stopping crime that's there. And this data also is from something called the Small Arms Survey, which has lots of problems. They won't release a lot of their data. So anyway, I just want to show you how some simple changes. So I'm just redoing their data using the Small Arms Survey. I'm not even going to go through all the problems with that, and the homicide rate. There's one other thing I want to just point out quickly, and that is a lot of people think that homicides and murders are the same, and they're not. Homicides are murders plus justifiable homicides. The United States is very high in terms of justifiable homicides compared to other countries, maybe about 20% or so. And if it were me, I would be comparing murder rates versus gun ownership. But there are very few countries that report murder rates. Almost all the countries just report homicide rates. Now, let me ask you a question. Let's say you were to go and just take out the United States, not include Russia and Mexico and Brazil in this comparison, which are developed countries, and just looked at these other developed countries. What you get is a slight negative relationship there. So if the question is, what can the United States learn in terms of crime from all these other countries, it's that having more guns, even with this very biased number of guns. This survey is paid for by George Soros, if you know who he is. You still get a negative relationship. If you add in the United States and these other countries like Russia, Mexico, and Brazil here, you'll see, in fact, even with the United States there, you get a negative relationship between gun ownership and homicides. Oops. And this is firearm homicides. And this is firearm homicides. Sure, if this is, well, I'll skip that. So another thing is I just thought I'd go and look at gun ownership and homicide rates in just Latin America. And you can see here, so this is for 2019, or the latest year that the data is available for. You can see the percent of adults with gun licenses in the different countries. And again, basically what you find is that higher gun ownership rates are associated with lower homicide rates. Okay, I think, well, maybe that's about it. No, I don't think so. but it's not going. Okay. So I'm going to skip this. I'll tell you what we'll do. Again, the thing I want to leave with you is just who benefits the most from having guns. And it's, again, the most vulnerable people in our society. And so, you know, politicians claim they care about poor people. I guess Lula claims that he cares about poor people. But if you really care about them, one of the things that you're going to deal with is going to be violent crime and property crime. Because look, it's just not the direct victims of crime. Where do you think these crimes are occurring? They're occurring in poor areas, making it costly and difficult for businesses to operate in those areas. It's making it so people in those areas aren't going to have the jobs. And what do you think it does to the value of houses and property that people own in those areas where you have high violent crime? Where you have high violent crime, it lowers property values. So those people, those poor people who live in those areas are hurt in many different ways other than directly through the crime rates, you know, being direct victims of crime. And yet, you know, the notion that somehow if we make it so they can't defend themselves and they just depend only on the police, that's a surefire way of making sure that people are going to be worse off. So anyway, I'd be happy to take some questions that people have on anything. But I appreciate your time, and I greatly appreciate you guys inviting me and Benny here for all the communications over the years. It's nice to finally have a chance to meet him. But anyway, I'm happy to go and take questions, so I don't know how you want to operate that. That reminds me, I should really thank the translator here. She has been kind of heroic in the sense that I dumped some stuff on her just this afternoon, and it was very nice of her to kind of adjust and try to take care of my last minute demands, so I greatly appreciate that. So who has questions? I guess we got a question over there. Is there a microphone or something to... Oh, there we got a question.
Boa noite. Eu gostaria de perguntar sobre que tipo de manipulação estatística é feita nos Estados Unidos. Aqui, por exemplo, nos estados do Rio de Janeiro, a gente pode associar o aumento da violência com o verão do Rio de Janeiro. A gente pode associar o aumento da violência com o aumento de consumo de sorvete, por exemplo. É uma manipulação fácil de fazer, e a esquerda faz isso o tempo todo. Que tipo de manipulação eles fazem pelo mundo?
Well, I think I could give you a whole semester's class on that. But look, do you have more crime during the summer? Yeah, you have more violent crime during the summer, in part because people are more likely to be outside, both the criminals and the victims that are there, making it easier to go and attack them. But look, what you need to look at when people are doing statistical work is you want to make sure they're using all the data that's available rather than just picking some select portion. If they drop out observations, then they better have a very good reason for why they're doing it, and it's pretty hard to think of many good reasons for that. But, you know, the problem is a lot of research is driven by ideology. I mean, my views have changed a lot over time on doing this research that I do. But, you know, it's one of the big problems we have in this world is that most academics are very left-wing types. And in the United States, I'm kind of often asked, why is it that there's such a divide politically? You know, what motivates people to have support for gun control? And I think one of the reasons is just whether you trust people. So let me give you an example from the United States context. And this may help explain some of the bias that's there. We have the government under President Obama tell people exactly what type of health insurance they could buy. So everything that's in the insurance, you have like no choice, okay? You either get the insurance that's approved with all the coverage that's there, or you don't have it. And that's because they don't trust people to make decisions about their health insurance. But if you don't trust people to make decisions about their health insurance, how are you going to trust them to make decisions like with weapons? I mean, whether you trust somebody with a weapon is kind of the ultimate thing, whether you trust people to make decisions or not. And I think that's kind of the left-right divide. People on the right are more willing to trust individuals to make decisions in many different areas in life. People on the left, particularly left-wing academics, think that they're much smarter than everybody else. And they're the ones who should be making the decisions for everybody else. And so I think, you know, people kind of want to find things to reconfirm their view of the world. And I think that's kind of the bottom line in terms of the biases that are there. But it's a big problem. Yeah, go ahead.
Olá, professor. Parabéns pelo trabalho. Tenho 3 livros do senhor. E...
Wow, I owe you a dinner.
Gostaria de perguntar se o senhor ainda é chamado para algum debate lá nos Estados Unidos, ou todos já estão com medo e ninguém mais aceita nenhum debate. E como levar informações de que armas não são ruins, armas podem proteger as pessoas, numa conversa informal entre amigos, como o senhor sugere, sem levar tanta estatística e tantos números.
Right. Okay, well, you've asked 3 different questions. I'll see if I can remember all of them. The first question was about debates. One of the problems in the United States is just getting people to debate. And gun control proponents, they know that you're more likely, so like if I go to a university and give a debate, they know that if they participate, you're going to have a larger crowd than you would have otherwise. And so they don't want to do it. They know that a lot of the TV networks want to have people on both sides of the debate there to participate. So what they do is they have an agreement among the different gun control groups not to participate in any debates on TV or universities or whatever if I'm involved. I have a discussion in one of my books, I can't remember which one. I think it may be, well, it's either Gun Control Myths or The War on Guns. But what you find happen is that I'd get calls from a TV network, and they say, are you willing to go and debate such and such? And I say, sure, I'm happy to do it. And I'll be driving in to the TV station. And as I'm driving in, I'll get a call back from the network and say, well, we're really sorry, but we told the people with, you know, Michael Bloomberg's group or whatever that you had agreed to debate, and they insist that we disinvite you. Sometimes I've even been asked, well, can you suggest somebody else to take your place there? But usually they just let the people from the other side on. I've had a couple times where that hasn't worked out for them. One time was pretty funny. C-SPAN, which is kind of, they air you know, the Congress and the president speeches and things like that a lot. They have a program called Washington Journal in the morning. And Michael Bloomberg's research director had been invited to go and participate. And they asked me if I would debate him. I said, sure, I'm happy to do that. And so the producer then called up the research director and said, John Lott's agreed to do it. And he tried to argue with her, telling her that she should disinvite me. And she said, well, I've already invited him, he's already accepted. And so then he said, well, I can't come. I just realized I had something else to do at that time. And what happened was she said, well, that's really too bad. We're still going to do it with John. And he said, oh, it turns out I can do it, but I can only do it for a half hour, and it has to be the last half hour, so Lott will go first, and then I'll be able to follow after him. Anyway, the producer was sufficiently upset about him, which was very unusual, because as I say, they normally just cave, that she called me back, told me the story, and she said, I really hope that you mentioned that he refused to debate you live on the air on the show. And so I did at the end of my segment. And when he got on, the very first caller that she had go in there was asking him why he wouldn't debate me. So, but that was an unusual outcome to have happen. Now, you're going to have to remind me now. I knew I was going to forget the questions. Let's see. Well, could you remind me the question?
Sorry.
Summarize what the two were.
Ok. Como levar as informações sobre armas, que armas são boas, para pessoas numa conversa informal, num bar, jantar?
Okay. No, I think that's an extremely important question. Look, you mentioned numbers earlier and doing it without numbers. I think one thing I frequently hear, and I think is wrong from people, is that numbers just don't matter in this debate. I think they do matter a lot. But what you have to realize is that people are bombarded with information about guns all the time. Without even trying, they can probably think of maybe thousands of news stories that they've heard over time about bad things that happen with guns. Even in the United States, people rarely hear about the benefits that happen with guns. Last year, we did a report that looked at news coverage in the United States on crimes with guns and crimes that were stopped by people with guns. And if you looked at the top 5 largest newspapers in the United States, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, USA Today, the Wall Street Journal, between those 5 papers, they had a total of 10 stories on defensive gun uses. And most of them went bad. You know, somebody accidentally shot somebody else, or you have a situation where somebody had the gun taken away from them and used against them. And by contrast, those 5 papers had a total of like 2,600 and some crimes committed with guns where somebody was either killed or injured in the crime. And so, and if you have CNN, which you probably know about, or MSNBC, they had 0 defensive gun uses that were mentioned. So you're a well-read person, you follow the news carefully, and you think, geez, people never use guns to go and do it. Facts matter. It's just that you have to think about facts much more broadly than simple you giving them numbers. Because you go and give them numbers, in any case, it kind of falls into this ocean of information that they have from watching the news media all the time. So one of the things you have to do is you have to kind of think about ways to get across to people how biased the media is. Because you have to get them to question whether or not this perception that they have is accurate. So The other thing that you have to do is, I forget what I was going to say, but just give me a second. I can't remember where I was going on that. But the way I often do it is I'll ask them questions such as what I asked up here, a simple question, just saying, look, if guns on net are bad, then surely banning guns should lower homicide rates, right? Ask them a question. Say, can you name me one place in the world that's banned guns? So you're looking before and after the ban and seen murder rates go down. People may mention someplace like Japan, for example. But the thing with Japan is they've had an incredibly low murder rate forever. As far back as the data seems to go, for hundreds of years, they have had an incredibly low murder rate. What you want to do is get them to say, name me one place that's banned guns, and we have the data both before and after the ban where it's gone down. It should be easy, right? You know, it seems like Brazil, this should be an easy case to make. Because, you know, you back in 2018, how many gun licenses did you have in the country? 330,000? Wasn't it pretty much just police and military that were allowed to go and own the guns at the time? So you have a country of like, what, 213 million people? And you have almost no one among civilians legally own guns? And yet you guys have had an incredibly high murder rate. They said, well, it would have been even higher. Again, you know, I showed you some graphs earlier. What are the countries with the really high murder rates? The countries with the really high murder rates among developed countries are Mexico. You know, Mexico has less than 1/10 of 1% of the population is legally licensed to own a gun. It's much less than 1/10 of 1%. So that's less than 1 out of every 1,000 people in Mexico is licensed to own a gun. And yet Mexico has a murder rate that's about 30 per 100,000 people. So, you know, it seems like there are lots of very simple examples that you can go and give them about that. You know, Mexico used to have much more common gun ownership. It was in 1972 that they essentially changed the Constitution, made it very difficult to get guns. At that point, only one gun store was allowed in the country. It's run by the military. Its guns are incredibly expensive. The most powerful gun that you can legally buy in Mexico since 1972 is a .22 caliber short round rifle. Okay? So, I mean, I see some people laughing at that, and you probably should. That's not the guns that the drug gangs use in the country. So the problem that you face is that when you do things like ban guns, murder rates go up for a simple reason, and that is who obeys the law. If you have a ban on guns, and it's the law-abiding citizens who obey the rules, not the criminals, it actually makes it easier for criminals to go and commit crimes. And Nikki Gozer is going to be speaking in a minute, but she has an example about gun-free zones that are there. Because when you go and have a gun-free zone, so let's say in the United States, there's a 2-year prison sentence if you go and you take a gun into a school area where it's banned. Well, for you or me, 2 years in prison is a pretty big penalty, right? To be a felon would dramatically change my life and change your life if you became a felon. But let's say you're somebody who's planning on killing 10 people, or 20 people, or 30 people. Are you really going to be deterred by a 2-year prison sentence? I mean, you may, assuming you live, and most of these guys are planning on dying, you may be facing 10 or 20 life sentences or death penalties. Is really a 2-year penalty going to be the one that, well, you know, I was willing to do this for 20 life sentences, but you put another 2 years on it, and that's just too much. I won't do the crime now. So I hope that helps a little bit in terms of it. Okay. We have any other questions? Yeah, I guess we got quite a few people here.
Hello, Dr. John Lott. My name is Dr. Beretta here in Brazil. I believe I can speak on behalf of all Goianians here in Brazil. We are very glad to have you here.
Okay.
I have two questions for you.
Okay.
Two questions for you. One question is, I believe... They asked me to speak in Portuguese.
But she'll translate it, and I'm happy to have you speak in English if you want to do that. I'm just saying she'll translate your question into Portuguese for everybody else.
Okay, I go on. I have two questions for you.
Sure.
One, I believe it's very important. President Bolsonaro here in Brazil have been proven empirically that more guns don't mean more crimes.
Right.
This is a very important example we have here in Brazil now, as an increase of guns very high and the increase of homicides very high too. How this impacts in gun control laws in the United States? This is my first question. The second question I have is, for the Americans, the perception. We have the war in Ukraine. At the land of the blinking lights in Ukraine, President Zelensky finally released rifles for normal citizens to defend their country. How this example, living example, impacts in the American thinking about gun control related to national security of our country, in the case of United States.
Right.
How this impacts in the thinking of the Americans and how this impacts the Zelensky and Ukrainian war example in the gun control laws in the United States. Thank you very much, and once again, welcome to Brazil. We are very glad to have you here.
Well, it's quite an honor to be here in Brazil. I greatly appreciate it. It's only the second time I've been here. You have a beautiful country. You know, you ask important questions. I think the example in Brazil is important not just in the United States, but it's important worldwide. I had an op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal, which is like the biggest newspaper in the United States, back in June. And the point I tried to make there was very similar to the point I tried to make here earlier, and that is, look, all these experts in the media and in academia were predicting utter disaster for Bolsonaro's changes in the regulations that were there. They were predicting murder rates were going to soar, okay? And one of the key things that I think is important for this debate is that these gun control advocates keep on making predictions that turn out not to be true, okay? And it takes away their credibility. You would think in the current political debate here in Brazil, I mean, we're just talking about a few years ago. I mean, it's not just international news media outlets and international experts, but I've seen a lot of, quote, experts here in Brazil were predicting utter disaster in 2019 and 2020 that we're here. And so what needs to be done to some extent, if it were me, if I was writing an op-ed here in Brazilian newspapers and stuff, would just be, look, here are the quotes that the people were making, these experts, and here's what happened. And I may even go through some of the, you know, they have explanations for what happened, that there's some places in Brazil that had changes in policing policy. Well, those changes were occurring at the same time that they were predicting disaster, and yet they still predicted disaster. So they must have thought that the gun control changes were going to offset that. So, but even if they do say, well, there's some places they're changing these rules, why is it that we're seeing this drop in murder rates across the board here, and not just in some places? So it seems like, you know, the important thing is to educate Brazilians about this stuff in the next few months there. But look, does it matter in terms of the United States? Yeah, well, that's the reason why I got the op-ed published in the United States, because it affects the credibility of gun control advocates, because a lot of these gun control advocates were in the United States. You have like the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the thing is, this is how the gun control debate has evolved over time in the United States. States first started to pass these right-to-carry laws that allowed civilians to carry concealed handguns for their protection. And gun control advocates were predicting disaster that was going to be occurring there, just like with Bolsonaro's changes. And it didn't happen. And crime rates went down, and they looked bad. And often when these laws got initially passed, they convinced the legislators to have all sorts of so-called gun-free zones in the place. They say, okay, you can have a concealed handgun, but you can't carry it here, 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 and here. So like Texas, for example, had like 34 places, broad areas where people couldn't carry the guns. Well, after the law was in place for a few years, people said, they were wrong about all these other things. And so legislators would go back and they'd get rid of a few of the gun-free zones. Gun control advocates would again predict disaster, and it didn't happen. And then they would lose a little bit more credibility. And then they'd go back and say, well, we'll get rid of a few more of the gun-free zones. And eventually they got rid of all of them that are there, except for the ones that the federal government mandates. And so, this is not something that you're going to win instantly, and you're probably never going to win over the media on this, okay? And you're probably not going to win over a lot of academia on this stuff. But people out there know about these things. And the way you do it is you got to practice writing op-eds for newspapers and things like that, and doing alternative media, social media type things. But, so like I try really hard to write op-ed pieces, these opinion pieces in newspapers, in areas that normally aren't on my side of the debate. Because it's important to reach outside your bubble and get people who, normally would never hear the arguments on the other side. But it seems like Brazil, you have a perfect chance right now. I mean, here you have all these newspapers and magazines in Brazil and experts that predicted disaster. And so write some pieces, call them out. Just say, look, guys, you wrote this before. Don't you think at least it deserves a fair hearing to point out what happened on the other side? Op-eds, you just keep short. You learn how to write these things over time, and that's my advice. With regard to the Ukraine, I wish that they had started giving the guns to people earlier rather than just a couple days before the invasion that's there. I'm not sure how much of an impact it's going to have on the United States. I think it has more of an impact on Eastern Europe. I've talked to a number of people in Eastern Europe who have at least started to talk about changing their gun laws there so people can learn how to use these weapons just in case Russia decides to go in there. So you have the Baltics, so you have other places that are there where, they think that there's a big benefit for people being able to go and know in advance how to go and use these guns. The reason why it's not going to have as big of an effect on the United States is the United States isn't really likely to be invaded by Russia anytime soon. We got oceans on either side of us there. And the big reason that people own guns in the United States is crime, concern about crime. And we've had a big increase in gun ownership over the last couple years in the United States, in part because of the big increase in crime. Now, it's not rocket science. There's a reason why crime has gone up in the United States. We've had big cuts in the budgets for police. We've had prosecutors refusing to prosecute violent criminals, a lot of George Soros prosecutors. During the coronavirus, we had huge numbers of inmates being released from jails and prisons In many urban areas, over half. In some urban areas, 2/3 of inmates have been released. And on top of all that, we've had what's called bail reform. So people who are committing crimes are being let out without having to put up bail. And so you have people who may be facing lots of years in jail. Let me give you an example. I don't know if you heard about this, but there was a man who drove his car through a Christmas parade in Wisconsin, killing 6 people and sending 62 people to the hospital. He had tried to kill the mother of his child with a car just a couple weeks earlier. He also had 3 other felonies. If you add up all the prison time he was facing like 30 years in prison. The guy's 38. It's a good chance that he had life sentence there. 30 years for a 38 guy, it's a good chance he wouldn't get out. Well, what's the penalty now that you can impose on him for going and killing 6 people and sending 62 people to the hospital? What, are you going to give him another life sentence? A 3rd life sentence? A 4th life sentence? A 5th? A 6th? The 6th life sentence? Is that going to be the one that convinces him not to go and do that type of crime? So, you know, it's like you have people who have essentially free crimes that they can go and commit now because you've already imposed as much of a penalty as you can on them. So I'm happy to take other questions.
Boa noite, professor. Professor, eu entendo a minha vizinha, o meu primo, o meu tio serem desarmamentistas. Há 30 anos, pelo menos, eles são bombardeados por informações pró-desarmamento. Mas pessoas como George Soros, Barack Obama, CNN, eles têm acesso às informações verdadeiras. Eles sabem que as informações que apoiam o desarmamento são manipuladas. Tendo em vista esse conhecimento, eles saberem disso, o que realmente motiva essas pessoas? Qual a intenção, a motivação por trás, a real motivação por trás da defesa do desarmamento, sabendo que essas pessoas sabem dos malefícios do desarmamento? Obrigado.
Right, well, that's a good question, and it's related to something I was talking about before. There are 2 issues that I think are going on. One is kind of this left-right divide in terms of whether you trust people to make decisions. And I think a lot of people on the left, like George Soros and others, think that they're much smarter than everybody else, that they should make decisions. They don't trust you to make decisions in a wide variety of areas in your life. And guns are no different. They don't trust you for making decisions on your health care, and they surely don't trust you then for having something like a weapon, which requires even more trust that's there. I think there's more than that, though. I think what you have happen is that they like people being dependent on the government. So if you can't protect yourself, then you have to go to the politicians, essentially, and beg them to provide more police services there. And they have a lot of control. Where do they put the police? Who do they decide to go and protect? You know, again, as I've been trying to say, I think it's the most vulnerable people in our society which are hurt the most. They're never going to have enough police in Brazil to go and protect everybody that's here. They don't have enough police in the United States. I mean, the United States, we have 332 million people. We have 600,000 police. The thing is, not all the police are on the job at the same time. Maybe you have no more than 250,000 police that are on the job at any one time. How are 250,000 police going to protect 332 million people? They can't do it. It's impossible. And so, you know, you have parts of the United States, and I'm sure you have parts of Brazil too, where, you know, it may take an hour or 2 hours or 3 hours for police to go and arrive on the scene if you're in very rural areas that are there. When you're talking about crime, you're talking about something that can occur in a minute or just a couple minutes that are there. You don't have 5 minutes or 10 minutes. And, you know, a fast police response in the United States, a very fast police response is like 6 minutes. You know, you'll be lucky 8, 10 minutes often. People are dead before that. Crimes are committed well before the police are able to go and arrive there on the scene. It's the reason why I've shown you the surveys of police in the United States, where the police are among the strongest supporters out there for private ownership of guns, because they know that they can't, even though they know they're very important, and I know they're very important. Anybody who's, some people have said they've read my books, know that I think police are the single most important factor for reducing crime. Police themselves know that they virtually always arrive on the crime scene after the crimes occurred. Now, I guess I'll take one more question, and then I'm going to introduce somebody else to speak. Yeah.
Olá, muitas pessoas aqui no Brasil têm associado erroneamente a queda de homicídios com a pandemia. Como conseguimos explicá-las a verdade? E existe algum país que reduziu os homicídios durante a pandemia?
Okay, so here's the bottom line. You know, homicides were falling in 2019, before the pandemic occurred. The homicides fell in 2021, kind of after things were opening up here, right? My belief is that they're still falling now in 2022, and the pandemic, as we're all in this room here, obviously can't explain that, right? So the only year that the pandemic could possibly explain is 2020. Right? And, you know, if they want to go and explain 1 out of 3 or 4 years, fine. They can try to go and do it that way. But in the United States, we had the exact opposite happen. The pandemic was associated with a big increase in violent crime. A number of other countries, Canada and other countries, I mean, I haven't studied the whole world, and a lot of the crime data for other countries only comes out with a lag. But I don't think there's any strong evidence that the pandemic was associated with reductions in crime. My suspicion is, so like, look, I don't know, you can answer some questions to me, maybe Benny can answer this. Did they release a lot of prisoners from jails like they did in other countries because of the pandemic to keep them so that they weren't together? Well, that probably doesn't help reduce crime a bunch, okay? Well, anyway, that's probably the big thing that would be happening here. I don't think you have quite as nutsy of people cutting police budgets as we have here as we have in the United States. But, you know, the bottom line is they can't explain 2019. I don't think they can explain now. Maybe they can explain 2020, but that's just 1 year. And there are other things that were happening, as Benny's pointing out, in terms of releasing prisoners, that isn't conducive to lowering crime rates. All right, I really appreciate your time, but what I want to do is I want to introduce somebody to you. Her name is Nikki Gozer. She's the executive director of the Crime Prevention Research Center. Just so you know, the Crime Prevention Research Center, it's the group that I run. Just get back to the beginning here. And you can go and get our research that we have on lots of different places at crimeresearch.org. And if you want, you can sign up for our emails. They're in English, I apologize. But we send them out once every couple weeks. And you can see the research, you can see the tables and other things that we put together. But anyway, Nikki Gozer is the executive director. And there's a reason why Nikki is working with us, because she has seen firsthand violence. She's seen it happen in her life. It's changed her life dramatically, but she's learned some lessons from that. And I wanted her to speak briefly so that you guys could kind of learn a little bit of what she's had to learn through hard lessons. So thank you very much, and introduce Nikki now.